For several weeks, we've been talking about the need for, I call it emotional renewal. We've talked about when you feel overwhelmed because of the challenges and the stress of life. We talked about being spiritually dry. We also talked about there are times that we can feel all clogged up, and because the river of God should flow into us and shall flow out of us. The river changes and it invigorates and changes our life, and then that should be a river that flows out according to Jesus into the barren wastelands of life and touch other people's lives because of what God has done for us. We talked last week about the lukewarm church. There's three chairs. You're sitting in the hot chair, cold chair, or the lukewarm chair. The hot chair are people that are on fire for God. They're fully and totally committed. If you're in the cold chair, that means there's no fire and you're totally indifferent. If you're sitting in the lukewarm church, the lukewarm chair, you have your fire is fading and you're really not committed to anything. And the whole concept of the message last week was John was trying to get the church to understand that there is a spiritual deception taking place between you say and you are. They were saying, John said, you're saying that you're rich and increased with good and you have need of nothing, but you are wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked. So there was a deception taking place between their estimation of themselves and what Jesus saw them being. And so we talked about getting out of that chair. Jesus is standing at the door knocking. He's not going to force his way into your life. And all Jesus wants you to do is open the door by giving him permission. You open the door and let him come down. He wants to have a fellowship meal with you, just a table set for two. He desires that reconnection with you. But in all of this, what we see is that there are often times in the journey of life, and this is the phrase that you hear me say through the past several weeks, that you find yourself locked into a psychological prison of defeat. And you're locked into the psychological prison of defeat not because of what you know and what you believe, but because of what you feel and what you see. And what you feel and what you see is suffocating and overriding what you know and what you believe. And so you're locked into the psychological prison of emotional defeat. And we're going to talk a little bit about that today. And that leads me to the text that I want to share with you today on God is greater than. And we'll talk about that. Give me my text if you would. When I consider your heavens, the work of what? Your fingers. The moon and the stars, which you have set in place. Look at that. You see that moon? You see all those little dots there? I see those dots as where the finger of God just touched it and a star appeared. Are you with me here? When I consider your heaven, when you consider the heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, which you have set in place, what is man? Who is Ron Shaw that you're mindful of me? The Son of Man, that you care for him. Who is God that he is mindful? The one who's, the writer said in the beginning, God's created the heavens and the earth, and by his fingers he puts everything in place. That this God, who is so great and magnificent, is mindful of little old Ron Shaw. Let that sink in. Put your name in there. God is mindful. God is mindful of me. The one who touched all those stars, spoke the worlds into existence, and from the dust of the earth created man and breathed life into his nostrils, and clay became a living soul. That's the God that I serve. And so that God is greater than three areas in your life. He's greater than your regrets, your emotions, and your sin. And so let's look at, first of all, God is greater than your regrets. I'm going to give you a spiritual reality. There is nothing more tragic than to have your future hopes and dreams distorted by past memories or past regrets. I'll say it again. There's nothing more tragic than to look into your future and it's distorted. It's diffused. You can't see it clearly because you're overwhelmed by the weight of past choices that you've made. Are you understanding that Sometimes your reality has nothing to do with the enemy. It has everything to do with you. We like to blame him for everything. So he wants to say, don't you blame that on me. I was in Africa when that happened. It's our choices that we make at times that create the roadmap to where we find ourselves in, and we can't look into the future because of what we've done in the past. And so I want to look at your regrets through the eyes of Moses. Let's look at Moses for a moment. Moses was raised in the opulence of Egypt in Pharaoh's court. And you know the story. But he's also a Jewish boy and saw his Jewish brothers and sisters being mistreated in a horrendous way at the hands of the Pharaoh. And on one particular occasion, he became so angry at what was happening by an Egyptian taking advantage of a little Jewish person that he rose up and he killed this Egyptian. And as a result of that, when that became known, he had to flee. And we find himself now in the Midian desert, and he finally gets married. And here is the story of Moses. Can you imagine? Here was a man that was raised in the opulence and the fine atmosphere. Everything he wanted was right there. But because of a decision he made to kill someone, he is now tending sheep for his father-in-law in the dusty environment of Midian. Day in and day out, he leads those sheep to the pasture, but in the back of his mind, he looks into the future and he says, this is all my life is going to be. It's it. Oh, you see, we know that what's going to happen. We know the burning bush. He didn't know the burning bush was coming. All he saw, he goes to bed listening to the bleating of the sheep. He gets up in the morning listening to the bleating of the sheep, and he smells all the smells that go along with that, and he has to wipe his brow. He has to wipe the dust from his face. He has to do all of this, and he looks into the future, and he says, this is it, until the burning bush arrived, and God said something that I'm going to share with you. And here's the application I want to make. Your past does not negate future assignments from God. With all the 40 years he was back there living a total life of regret, of a decision that he could not undo. It was what it was. It is what it is in his life. He looked at that and he says, there's no future for me. This is it. I'm going to be a sheep herder from this point on. I'm going to have to smell this. I'm going to have to live with this heat and the dust. This is my life until the burning bush arrived, and God said, I've got a new assignment for you. Look what Jeremiah said. I know the plans I have for you in spite of where you're at, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. Some of you are seated here, and you're looking into your future, and it's distorted simply because of some things that have happened in your past that you cannot go and change, undo. It is what it is. I mean, how many of you could go back to one event and said, boy, I really would like to change that decision? Raise your hand. Come on, be honest. I've got about 1,000 of them. And my wife is always working on me. Ron, shut up. Well, she's a little bit more diplomatic. Because I look back and I'm saying, if I hadn't made that choice, there's one particular, I'm going to tell it the story later on, but there's one particular choice that we made that put us on about a 3-year path that we couldn't get off of. It just took some time to get through it. And I look back and say, why did I make that choice? Why? I'll tell you the story some other time, but not today. It's not today. I want you to understand that just because you've made a decision that you're living with now that is not the best environment to be in, and you're looking into your future thinking, there's no way God can use me because I'm locked into this prison right now and I can't seem to get out of it. I'm psychologically being defeated because I don't see anything in my future right now because of the choices that I have made. I want you to know that does not. Your past is your history. Your potential is in your future assignments that God is going to give you. And so God's got something for you in spite of living right now, not seeing a future because of the harvest from past decisions. Secondly, God is greater than your emotions. Here's the spiritual reality. There is nothing any more discouraging than the human inability to maintain your spiritual equilibrium because of debilitating emotions. Can I say it again? I want you to let that sink in. There's nothing more discouraging than your human inability to maintain a level of emotional stability, your spiritual equilibrium, that no matter what happens, you don't get knocked off your feet. That's what I'm calling about, spiritual equilibrium. But it happens because debilitating emotions rise up and challenge us. And there again, I've been talking for you several weeks. You find yourself locked into a psychological prison. Not a real prison. It's a psychological prison of emotional defeat. Not because of what you know and believe, but because of what you see and what your emotions are telling you. And so here you are in a psychological prison of defeat. So let's look at emotions through the eyes of David, Goliath, and the Israeli army. You know the story. Down in the valley the valley of Elah is a big, large giant by the name of Goliath. And every morning for 40 days he gets up and he taunts the armies of Israel, simply saying, listen, send a man to fight me, and whoever wins, the loser will have to be the servant and slave to the winner. And no one wanted to do that. You know why? Because that intimidating voice produced an emotional response in the army of Israel. In spite of their rich history of knowing all that God had done for them, starting with the huge exodus and all the things that God had historically done for them, in spite of that knowledge, what they knew to be true and believed, the intimidating voice of the giant placed them into the psychological prison of an emotional thing called fear. Anybody listening? They knew what God could do. They knew their historical narrative of all the blessings and the power that had been demonstrated. They knew that. But in spite of that, here the whole army of Israel is locked into this psychological prison called fear, and no one was willing to go down there and meet Goliath until a little shepherd boy arrived. The little shepherd boy had a different perspective of this giant. He saw the giant as an intimidating voice to the whole army of Israel, and it confused him because David knew as well the historical narrative of all that God had done in the history of Israel. He knew all those stories. They were required to teach those things and teach their kids. He knew that, but he also had experienced the real power of God by killing a lion and a bear. He knew this, so his whole paradigm was not based upon fear or an emotion. It was based upon what he knew God could do. And so with that as his background, he decided, I'm going to take care of this myself. So he chooses 5 stones and he goes down there and he says, today, you're not going to have a head, buddy. I'm going to cut it off. And he did. You know the story. Here's the application. You see, your emotions amplify your hopelessness, and faith exonerates them. Faith neutralizes them. Here you are locked into this psychological prison of emotional defeat. You know the history of God. You could even go back to times that God did something great in your life. You know the history of the Pentecostal movement. You know the history of what God can and cannot do. And yet you're locked in this psychological prison of emotional defeat because of your emotions. Are you listening? I know this is not a shouting kind of a message, but it's going to get down to your heart, especially when I get to the end. I can't tell you how many times in my own life I've been locked into an emotional, psychological prison, all because of emotions that were happening around me. And as a born-again believer and a pastor, I know what God can do. I know historically all the things that God has done in the Bible, the book for me. I know what God has done in my own personal life in this church. I know those things. And yet at times I found myself, in spite of what I knew, being locked there because of what I felt and what my emotions were telling me was going on in my life. Can anybody identify with that? That's where I was at. I'm thinking, man, grab yourself by the, you know where, just grab yourself back and get up. It's easier to say that than do it. Grab you by the bootstraps and get up. And sometimes you tell yourself that, but it's hard to do at times. Why? Emotions are powerful enemies. And the enemy exploits those emotions just like he was doing to the armies of Israel. David didn't buy into it. But sometimes we buy into it. Now let's look at God is greater than your sin. Here's a spiritual reality. We all have the unique ability to, you've already read it, you're ahead of me. I'm not going to put those up anymore until I get it out there. Then I'll put it up there because you read faster than I speak it. We all have the unique ability to identify the sins and the failures of everybody else around us while ignoring and justifying our own. I'm going to repeat that again. We all, every single, don't you dare say this is for somebody else, it's for you. We all have the unique ability to look around and say, I can see your problem. Let me tell you what your problem is. I know what your sin is. While we justify and ignore our own personal sins and failures. I put it this way. We have a tendency to judge everybody else by their actions and what they do, but we judge ourselves by our intentions. Boy, I just popped us, didn't I? I'm on a roll today. This has nothing to do with the sermon. I'll get to the point here in just a moment. I started to text my friend Joe Oden. How many of you have heard Joe Oden get up here and just tell all about Alabama, how Alabama done this, and Alabama is this? I wanted to text him to say, Joe, you're not even going to be able to preach today because Alabama lost last night. You say, Joe, I'm praying for the church where you're going to be at. Joe, if you listen to this, Dave, I didn't have time to get that text to you, but that has nothing to do with this message, but it was fun to tell you that story. To just rib my friend Joe just a little bit, okay. I want us to look at sin through the eyes of three sets of people. Let's look at it through the Pharisees, Jesus, and a woman caught in adultery. Here's the story. The hypocritical Pharisees that Jesus called whitewashed sepulchres. And he excoriated them on many occasions. I believe they set this woman up, is what I believe, or they were watching her because they knew of her reputation. They knew if they could catch her and bring her to Jesus, they felt they could trap Jesus. And so they catch this woman in the very act of adultery, and they knew what the law was, and they knew Jesus as a rabbi would know what the law was as well. So they bring this woman to Jesus while he's teaching, and they interrupt the session there, and they said, Jesus, we caught this woman in the very act of adultery, and what do you say? We know what the law says. And of course, Jesus knew that according to the law, she should be stoned to death. That was the law. Jesus bent down and wrote something in the sand. Then he says, he who is without sin, let him cast the first stone. He bent down and wrote again. Then he got up and he said, woman, where are your accusers? She said, I have none. And he said, go and sin no more. I want us to notice something before I get to the main point. The only person who had the moral authority to condemn her did not. The only person. All these other people were sinful individuals. Jesus was born of a virgin with a sinless nature, and he was the only one who had the moral authority and the moral right to say, you're guilty. But he did not do that. He said, go and sin no more. Here's the application. Only Jesus can take a sinner and write a new script for their life. Only Jesus. Come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be white as snow. Though they are red like crimson, they shall be like wool. Paul put it this way. When you come to Christ and you ask him to forgive you of your sins, the old nature, the old sinful nature is dead. and a new nature has been imparted inside you. That's the new script for your life. It's called the old has died and the new has been resurrected to life. Are we grateful that God can take Ron Shaw with a life filled with a lot of mistakes and failures, and he can still, even at my age, and Gary's age, can write new scripts. Because you see, even at my age, at 70, I'm not through. I'm not near being through. Why? Because even now, God is writing new scripts. Because when I ask God, I'm asking God, give me new revelation for the next few years of my life. What do you want from me? I'm not saying, God, I'm ready to take my bootstraps off and stop. I'm not ready for that. And until you say so, then download to me what you want me to do. Write a new script for my life. Even when I make mistakes and I'm not perfect in those things, even that, write me a new script for my life. Only Christ can do that for you, ladies and gentlemen, is write a new script. I'm going to give you my final thought, then I'm going to tell you a story, and then we'll serve communion. You can't run from your reality, but God can change your perception of your reality. You can't run from it. The story I'm about to share, just some brief history of it, but I didn't intend to share this story until I got up this morning and began to pray and put the final touches on it. And I got to this, putting that in there, finishing that, putting the right font in it, all that kind of stuff. And God said, you remember how I changed the perception of your reality? In October of 2015, Sherry and I were on a vacation in Branson, Missouri. It was one of our favorite places to go. We make those bones about it. On October the 14th, we went to the movie theater to see the movie that had just come out. Remember the movie called War Room? If you haven't seen it, we've got it. We'll show a movie night. I've got it. We show it. It's a powerful movie. The Power. How many of you have seen it? I'd just like to know. All right, most of you have. We had just seen it because it had just come out. We're on vacation. We needed something to do, so we went and saw that. Boy, it just moved me. The power of prayer. What you can do in a closet of prayer if you just pray and ask God. And so we'd seen that later on in the evening, went to eat, and I got up the next morning. Even on vacation, I get up early as I always do, and I got up at 4 o'clock in the morning. And I walked across the little parking lot to the edge of a fairway where a golf course was. Our condo is right on a golf course. And my heart was broken. Because the year before, in August of 2014, something happened that fractured our family, major fracture. We'd worked hard we didn't cause it. We tried everything we could do to resolve it. And the whole next year, we tried everything we could do to resolve it. But it wasn't resolved. And so, church, for a year, Sherry and I lived in a psychological prison of pain, anguish, and anxiety. More than you can believe, unless you've been in something similar to that. The emotional pain was almost debilitating. It could almost stop you in your tracks. A heartbreaking beyond what you can experience. And so that morning, I'm walking across, and I've got my cup of coffee, and I'm pacing back and forth on that fairway. And I just seen the movie War Room, so it was in my spirit. I wish I could adequately describe what I felt that morning with the brokenness inside of me. We realized that we couldn't run from it. It is what it is. All of a sudden, something spiritual happened is all the way I can describe it. There became an awareness of the presence of God. Have you ever experienced that? I stop in my tracks. There's an awareness of the presence of God. I've experienced His presence, but this was something different. I stopped and I knew God was there. There was no voice, there was no lights, there was a spiritual awareness that God had come down on that fairway to talk to me. He said, Ron, I'm going to give you 6 words. And I think it's going to help you. I think you know what those words are. Peace is the reward of surrender. It was right there that God wrote a new script for my life. Are you hearing me? It was right there. In spite of being locked into this psychological prison of emotional defeat, pain, and anguish, and all these kind of things, in spite of all of that, God, and not being able to run from it, God came down and he said, Ron, I'm going to write a new script for your life. If you will give this to me, that is your new script. Surrender it to me. And when Sherry got up that morning, I shared with her that spiritual experience. In church, nothing has changed in the past 7 years. It still is just like it is, but God wrote a new script. It changed my perception of my reality. The reality has not changed. It's just my perception of that reality. And you see, you're locked into this prison of emotional, psychological defeat and despair. And you can't see a future. It's distorted by all the mistakes that you've made. And you don't think there's anything out there for you. And the enemy exploits those emotions, and you know what God can do. You know what you've seen God do, but in spite of that, you can't seem to get out of it. I want you to know God can reach down to where you're at right now and change your perception if you'll just give it to God. I want you to stand with me.